Being a die-hard Willys Jeep fan, when Holley came out with a single barrel EFI unit, I knew I had to try it out on my Jeep. And back in 2021, I made a very detailed video of how to install an EFI unit onto a Willys L-134 engine, made my own adapter, figured out the fuel system, the whole 9 yards. And I couldn't believe the response from the Jeep community. Everyone was super positive and wanted to know, would I make them an adapter to put fuel injection onto their Jeep? And here we are today. This is the very first product that I made for Turn and Burn, which is a company that I started just for making these EFI adapters. However, there will be more Willys performance parts in the future. In this video, we're going to go over everything that comes with the adapter kit, why we picked each specific component that we did. You can watch my 2021 video and really go into depths on the differences between the EFI and the stock carburetor unit and the problems that you'll run into trying to put one of these on a stock Jeep intake manifold. How do we make the EFI unit adapt to the stock intake manifold, carburetor linkage, and work with the factory air cleaner system? When you go to slide this onto the Jeep intake manifold, you're going to notice that the bolt holes don't line up at all. The bolt holes on the EFI unit are much wider than the stock Jeep intake manifold, and it doesn't even come close to bolting on. So you already need an adapter just to get the intake bolts to line up perfectly. The second problem is that the carburetor linkage on the WO, the throttle arm just pulls it straight back. There's no issues there. However, on the EFI unit, the linkage goes up in the air. If you attempt to hook up the throttle linkage to try to pull it sideways, the throttle arm's already aimed down, so naturally just wants to keep shoving down, but that's right where the stop is on the throttle. It needs to go up in the air. And then lastly comes with the air cleaner setup. You look at the lip on the carburetor, super tall. Unfortunately, the Sniper is not designed the same way. They've got this little bracket on top where it's designed where you put more of like an old school muscle car air cleaner on top, and then you run a bolt into here, and that's what holds it down. You pull this thing out, I mean, you just can squeeze it and it pops right out of the EFI unit. Actually really nice how easy it comes out. Then you go onto the Sniper lip, very short. I mean, not even half of what the stock carburetor is. If you hold up the air horn right here, the slots are sticking up above the carburetor and it would suck air all around these slots. However, if you even tried to hose clamp this onto the EFI unit, what it's going to do is squeeze the bottom but not the top, and when it squeezes the bottom, it just keeps shoving it off the EFI unit until it just completely pops off. So you can't even clamp this thing onto the EFI unit without it just falling off. With all these parameters in mind, that is how the Turn and Burn kit was created. We have an adapter that goes from the wide bolt pattern of the EFI unit down to the small bolt pattern of the factory intake manifold. This front linkage piece connects to the EFI unit, and the rear linkage piece goes to your gas pedal. So when you pull back on the gas pedal, you're pulling the EFI linkage up here upwards. So it just makes everything work in sync. We have throttle linkages that utilize Heim joints, so they swivel all around. So most of these Jeeps, unfortunately, the throttle arms that come off the gas pedal, they have huge differences side to side in where they're angled. We needed something that's extremely adjustable. With Heim joints, the throttle arm can be aimed all different directions right here. And then this has both left hand and right hand threads. And then the last thing is this air horn adapter. So this is a really simple piece, and it's just a press bit. You sit on top of your EFI unit and you push down or hit it with a mallet. As you can see, this extends the overall height of the lip, so you can actually cover up the entire air horn slots, and you have plenty of room to get a clamp on here to keep the air horn from popping off. Going back to that 2021 video, I made this adapter. It's a little bit shorter than the current style because I designed this one in mind with using the stock carburetor diffuser gasket, which has this V-notch piece of metal on here. You absolutely cannot use this gasket with an EFI system. The entire purpose of this gasket is to help atomize the fuel of a carburetor. So the thought is, as the fuel is sucked into the intake manifold, it swirls it around to atomize it so it's easier to burn in the combustion chambers. And for some reason, this will not work with EFI. The EFI unit is designed to only use a small gasket, not the carb diffuser gasket. This thing worked great in my video. It was wintertime, I had no problems at all. However, this thing is made out of steel, and the problem is that if you look at a stock manifold system, really inefficient, honestly. I don't know why flathead engines typically go this route, probably because of cost. This little section is the exhaust manifold, and this is the intake manifold. When you look at this, you know exhaust manifolds are always extremely hot, and you don't want your intake to be hot because hot fuel and hot air is not good for an engine. Well, unfortunately, with the Willys Jeep setup, the intake manifold is bolted together to the exhaust manifold, and all this goes onto the side of the engine. Well, as your exhaust gets hot, so does the intake manifold. And the intake manifold on these Jeeps get so hot, especially off-roading out west, like in Utah, Moab, that kind of area. If you try to take your hand and just wrap it around the carburetor after wheeling for a few hours, you could actually end up with severe burns because the carburetors get so extremely hot and the fuel starts to boil and the vapor lock. It's just not good at all. Naturally, when you have a fuel injection system, you've got a computer that's built into this throttle body, and you don't want the computer to get hot because it's just really bad for electronics. So the turn and burn adapter is made out of billet aluminum, and a really nice feature about this is that the aluminum acts as a heat sink. When all this is bolted together, the heat from the exhaust manifold, which is naturally transferred into the intake manifold, is dissipated through this aluminum adapter because aluminum dissipates heat much quicker than steel or cast iron. By the time you get to the computer system of the EFI unit, it is way cooler than the temperature of the intake manifold. During the process of building this adapter, I found something really interesting that most people probably don't know. On the stock Willys carburetor, the bore, which is the center right here, is not nearly as big as the intake manifold. If you take an intake manifold gasket right here and you slide it over the studs, you'll notice that the gasket fits the intake manifold perfectly. Now if you take that same gasket and put it on the stock Willys carburetor, as it's designed to do, you're going to notice that the carburetor bore size is way smaller than the gasket and way smaller than the intake manifold. So essentially, the stock carburetor is choking down a significant amount of air into the engine. And this is one really important aspect that we took into consideration building the adapter kit, because we wanted to utilize the entire bore of the intake manifold and the entire bore of the Sniper, and that is how we came up with this design. So if you flip this over, and this is the manifold side, you put this gasket on, and nothing sticks out of the gasket. It's a really good fit. And that being said, we include this gasket with the kit because there's tons of different gaskets on the market, and they vary in size. And this is the biggest inner bore gasket that we can find that is a great fit to our adapter kit. Alright, let's begin installing the EFI adapter kit. Now this is exactly how it should arrive to you in the mail, with the linkages just loosely bolted together onto the throttle body piece. The first thing you want to do is remove the linkages from this arm in the center. This throttle arm that bolts to the throttle body and the linkages, this is made out of mild steel. It is just raw metal and it needs painted whatever color that you want. So let's go ahead and unbolt that and get it painted. The linkages right here are just hand threaded on, so you just pop the nut off and the linkages will slide off the throttle arm. And then we're going to take a wrench and unbolt the arm from the throttle body adapter. Once the arm is off, paint it whatever color that you want and then reassemble it. We're going to pretend that I painted it a perfect color and we're going to go ahead and reassemble it. Now you'll notice when you took this apart, there's a couple spacers. I'm not going to guarantee this is what the spacers always look like. This was the very first adapter run. They might change in the future, but just know that there's a bolt The throttle arm goes here and then the spacers after the fact. If you look at this bolt, we've designed the EFI adapter to utilize the tapered edge of the bolt. So there's threads right here. It tapers outwards to the shank of the bolt, and the shank meaning this flat section of the bolt where there's no threads at all. The threads taper onto that area. And the EFI adapter is designed to utilize the taper of this bolt for a really nice tight fit. Now, I personally would take just a small dab of red Loctite just to put on the thread of the bolt, just to ensure that things don't come loose. But between a little bit of red Loctite and that tapered fit, you should be good to go. We got our Loctite on. We have our theoretically painted throttle arm. Then we've got our spacers that we're going to thread back into the throttle body adapter. Ensure the throttle arm still spins freely, which it does. Then simply reinstall the throttle linkages just as it was mailed to you. We've got the long throttle linkage on the driver's side of this arm, and then on the passenger side we've got the short linkage. So you put that together, you put the nylock nut onto here. Now when you go to tighten this, it's going to bottom out. Make sure you get it nice and snug. Let's go ahead and do a demonstration of what it takes to remove a stock Willys WO carburetor. You need to remove all the gaskets on your intake manifold. It doesn't matter how good they look, you're not going to use any of them. A, you don't want fuel leaks. Now, because this adapter is designed to utilize that full bore of the intake manifold, there's just a super tight clearance on the bottom of this that requires the Allen bolts. So as you'll see, if you try to slide it on the factory studs, yes, it will go down. Getting a nut on here will be pretty much impossible. The nut's just going to slam into the side of the throttle body and not want to go down. So what you need to do is simply remove the studs on the intake manifold. I'm going to be honest, it's not a fun job at all depending how long they've been in there. There's a bunch of cool videos online that you can watch on stud removal, special tools, all that good stuff. So really research that before you even attempt it and screw something up, because I know that I would. Onto the Jeep engine. Once you've got your stock intake manifold studs removed, you need to clean off the mating surface on the manifold. Just take a wire brush, clean this really nice, and then take a vacuum and make sure there's no debris that fell into the intake manifold. So suck any debris out of both sides of the manifold, then you should be good to go. Then we're going to install the adapter itself using 2 zinc-plated Allen bolts. First, we place the intake manifold gasket onto the engine, and the next step is the throttle body itself. Personally, I like to take the bolts and stick them through the throttle body. That when I press it onto the engine, I can locate the holes and thread them right in. Now you can use red Loctite, anti-seize, pretty much anything you want. I think anti-seize would be a good idea if you ever plan on disassembling the engine in the nearby future, especially living the rust belt. Things rust up pretty quickly. So we're going to go ahead, set this on the engine, locate it with the 2 bolts in place, and then we're just going to thread them on. If you ever worked on Willys Jeeps, you know that space is a huge limitation, and unfortunately if you go to tighten these bolts down with a standard Allen wrench, you just cannot get it underneath the intake adapter. This is utilizing a 5/16 Allen wrench. So what I did is I had another one sitting around and I just cut the end of it off, that way I could fit it underneath the manifold adapter. So once you have a cut off wrench, you can go through and just tighten everything. You want to tighten it evenly. The next step is getting this rear throttle linkage mounted onto the Jeep gas pedal linkage. If you look at the gas pedal linkage, you have a small hole in the bottom. That is your throttle return spring. This top hole is for the throttle linkage itself. Now unfortunately, a stock Jeep is about a 3/16 inch hole, and we need a 1/4 inch hole to work with our aftermarket throttle linkage. Take the linkage, hold it forward with your hand, but keep your hand out of the way. And then take a 1/4 inch drill bit, and it's definitely very awkward. and drill that to a 1/4 inch. Now yours is not going to go as smooth as that. I already drilled mine out. But once you have this drill out to a 1/4 inch, then we can take our throttle linkage and you're going to put it towards the passenger side of that throttle arm. Feed the 1-inch 1/4-20 bolt from the driver's side into the passenger side. Now, why do we go from that side? Well, if you look at the firewall on these Jeeps, there's really not a lot of clearance. So when you pull back on the gas pedal, you want as little sticking out on the driver's side as possible. Obviously, the bolt's super skinny. If you had a nut sticking out here with extra threads, it's just going to catch that firewall. Alrighty, at this point we're ready to install the actual Holley Sniper EFI unit. My gasket is stuck to the bottom of my Sniper. Otherwise, you put your gasket on here first, then set the Sniper unit onto here. Then you're going to tighten this down with 2 3/8 bolts. Now on the front one, you can take that bolt and twist it right into the adapter unit. As for the rearmost bolt on the EFI unit, you're going to use the same exact bolt as the front. However, remember earlier when I was talking about on the gas pedal linkage, there's a second small hole at the bottom for a throttle return spring. The throttle return spring mounts to the original linkage and then extends forward onto our EFI unit. Now when it is forward, what does it connect to? Well, it uses the same exact bracket that comes on your carburetor. So you slide the spring onto the rear hole. You're bolting on the back of the EFI unit. Make sure you've got this original throttle return bracket bolted to it. Now my bracket is bent downward slightly. A stock bracket that you've not messed with is going to be straight out. And what you're going to find is when it is straight out, this throttle return spring is going to catch the linkage back here and it's going to hold everything up. So once you get everything bolted down, just go ahead and push down on this bracket to give it a little bit of a bend. Here's a great visual of exactly what I'm talking about. There's the throttle return plate with the spring connected right on top of the EFI unit. The last part we need to do is actually connect the throttle linkage to the EFI unit itself. So if you pull your throttle linkage back, this thing is set to swivel any which direction. And there's a little ball on the throttle linkage on the Holley. So you just take the throttle linkage on the EFI adapter and it just snaps into place. And that is what your finished EFI throttle linkage looks like. Now the only thing we need to do is adjust your throttle linkage. That way you make sure you're getting full throttle on the EFI unit. As for the front linkage, it's not as critical as the rear linkage. So what I would do is just take the rear jam nut and tighten it against the rear heim joint, and then the front jam nut against the front heim joint, and we will just worry about the rear linkage itself. As for the rear linkage, we have left hand and right hand threads on this turnbuckle. So if I go to twist it, let's just say backwards, it's extending the entire linkage. If I twist it the other way, it shortens it. So it makes adjustment really quick and easy because depending which way you turn it, longer or shorter gives you more or less throttle throw on the gas pedal. Come into your Jeep and push down on the gas pedal all the way, and then with your left hand you need to reach over the engine compartment. It's a little awkward, but go ahead and grab the front of your throttle linkage and attempt to pull it up. So you can see that I can pull up my EFI linkage just a little bit, just telling me that I've got a little bit too much play on my back linkage right here. So I'm going to shorten that up just a little bit. Come back here, push the gas pedal down again. Try it, and I've got no play on that throttle linkage. When it came to purchasing parts to design this rear throttle linkage, this turnbuckle is pretty long, I gotta say, and I would have rather had one shorter. That way there's a way more adjustment on each end before it bottoms out, but this is just what I gotta work with. So if your throttle linkage is small as possible, meaning the jam nuts are already closed up, there's no thread sticking out of either end of this turnbuckle, and you need a little bit smaller linkage, go ahead and twist off the heim joints and then remove one jam nut off each side. That's going to give you about 3/8 to 1/2 inch of smaller linkage adjustment. And if that's still not enough, go ahead and just take a grinder and cut a little end off this turnbuckle, which gets your linkage even smaller. And for our final trick, we know that the air cleaner will not go on the EFI unit. It's just going to fall right off. The turn and burn adapter is just a press fit. So set this on here, push down with your hand to get it started, and then just take a mallet and beat it on, and it's good to go. So then you take your air cleaner adapter, push this over your new adapter, put a hose clamp on it, and you're good to go. With all that being said, I hope your EFI installation works out perfectly and you're cruising down the trail before you know it.